Good morning, folks. This is Mr. Dan coming to you from the Landscape Design Classroom. And today I'm going to talk to you about selecting a greenhouse growing medium. So the main idea here is how can I decide on the best growing medium for greenhouse plants? We have soils for outside and inside. So talking about outside plants, that's going to be your natural home for plants. Deep fertile soils, depending on where you're digging out from, deep drainage, weed seeds, and typically you're going to find diseases and fungi in these types of soils. So when it says like deep fertile soils, that means like in this area, it'd be like going out to a farmland. If you go into like a regular like established neighborhood or out into the suburbs, you're going to find soils that really only go like a few inches deep just because that top layer or topsoil has been taken off over time. So if you're like eventually go out and check out some of these soils, then you want to make sure you're out in some deep farmland. So on the inside, roots are limited, shallow containers. Aeration, drainage, and water holding capacity are needed. And these are typically more weed-free and fungus-free. So a lot of the soils you're going to be using here are store-bought. That could be anything from Miracle-Gro to a peat moss. So speaking of peat moss, this is the main ingredient in most potting soils and greenhouse media mixes, formed from plant material decomposed under low oxygen conditions. So peat moss, I typically use only for planting large trees, since I grew up in a landscaping business. And we use peat moss a good bit for establishing brand new plants, but we tend to mix that in with some other growing medium we'll talk about. So, and there's some debate about future use, like I was saying. So for established plants, for something that's already been in the ground, there's not a whole lot of benefits, in my opinion, to adding peat moss later after something's established. So there's four kinds of peat moss: sphagnum moss and hypnaceous moss. These are both good for use in growing media. So if you want to have something that's going to start well, especially for newly established plants or growing from seed, then you'd want to go with one of these. So we also have reed and sedge peats and humus or muck. These aren't so good for growing media, but we'll get into that momentarily. So sphagnum moss. So it's one of the best forms of organic matter to be used in a growing medium. So organic matter can be a lot of different things. It can be waste from an animal. It can be plant parts. It can even be bone from an animal that decays over time. The advantages to this, or to sphagnum moss, is lightweight, very absorbent, fungicide characteristics, and better drainage and aeration. This soil is very light. It goes in very easily. It's super easy to pick up by hand, so it's not at all heavy. So main sources from this are Germany, Canada, and Ireland. So moving on to hypnaceous moss. This is suitable for growing media, but not as good as sphagnum moss. So you definitely want to use more of a sphagnum moss if you're going to start some new plants. I tend to want to experiment with both and see where they go, but I also do some different soil amendments. So we're going to get into that stuff a little bit later. Partially decomposed mosses, more rapid decomposition than sphagnum, which is not a bad thing. If you have some newly establishing plants and there's decay going on within the soil that they're in, adding more soil is never really a bad thing as long as you're keeping it watered properly. So the source for this is the northern United States. So right here in Pennsylvania, you can definitely get hypnaceous moss. So reed and sedge peats, unsatisfactory for media use. Moderately decomposed, fine textured plants, less acid and fewer fibrous particles. Some of the faults here are rapid decomposition, fine particles, not enough fiber. So there's just not enough in this type of, in these peats to really establish anything or be of any real use, especially if you're working and planting in a greenhouse. So humus or muck, unsatisfactory for media use as well, kind of gets clumpy, formed from debris and plant material of unknown origin. So yeah, this is kind of stuff you don't really want to mess with inside of a greenhouse. It does have other uses. You can sometimes use this stuff around like trees you're planting out in somebody's yard that have already themselves been established. But typically, I wouldn't want to use this stuff anyway. So often contains silt and clay. And some of the faults does not improve drainage or aeration and decomposes rapidly. So remember, when we're talking about this stuff, this is just based on greenhouse. So you could use a humus or muck around regular trees. Like I said before, though, I probably wouldn't recommend it. So wood residue, that's byproducts of lumber and forest products industry. You can get these in large quantities at a very cheap rate. Most companies are just looking to get rid of the stuff. So most of the time, they may even just charge you trucking fees. But there are a lot of companies that will use this for mulch. So if it's one of those companies, you're going to pay top dollar for it. There's some disadvantages here. Requires additional nitrogen. So you could go to your local fertilizer or chemical store, like an Agway, Lowe's, any Home Depot, Advanced Turf Grass, Site One, any of those places, and you'd be able to get some nitrogen to add to this to make it a little bit more applicable to your needs. So sawdust, common and readily available. Walnut and uncomposted redwoods are not suitable. Typically, you're not really going to find the sawdust from either of those because those are pretty high quality woods, and almost all of it gets used for whatever they're using walnut or redwoods to build. So high in cellulose and lignin can cause nitrogen depletion without added nitrogen. So this is one of those sawdust I wouldn't really recommend for any of this stuff, but sawdust does have its uses, especially in a garage for an oil spill. So yeah, there's a use for everything. But remember, this is strictly for greenhouse growing media. Bark, the byproduct of pulp, paper, and plywood. Size is reduced by hammer milling and screening. Use compared to sphagnum moss, and age and composted before use. So bark could actually be pretty good for some greenhouse growing medium, but in all honesty, I would stick to the peat mosses, especially that sphagnum moss. The leaf mold, maple, oak, and sycamore leaves, composted for 12 to 18 months, and improves aeration, drainage, and water holding properties. So if you're using different types of leaves, you definitely want to stick to the maple, oak, and sycamore leaves. And it's not very widely used because honestly, 12 to 18 months in the greenhouse industry is a pretty long while to wait on some of those materials, and you just don't have a lot of people out there collecting. So some other byproducts: rice hulls, coir, that's from coconut husk, bagasse, and some others: manure, corn, cobs, straw, peanut shells, and pecan shells. The only one I would really recommend out of any of this stuff would be manure, but you got to be real careful. If you're using manure in something, if you cover it up too much, it's going to build up heat and it's going to burn out your seed. So a little bit's fine, but I would not use that as your total product. So organic materials, these are going to be from non-living sources. The reason you would use these is for increased number of large pores, decreased water holding capacity, and improved drainage and aeration. So some of these include sand, a basic component of soil, medium and coarse sands used to improve media texture. It's very inexpensive. Heavier weight, high transportation costs. So if you're using a lot of sand, you're going to definitely be paying whenever you transport the product to your customer. So a little bit of sand's okay, but I really wouldn't go too crazy. Okay, perlite. Perlite is a really awesome material that really aerifies your soil. It's extremely light. We have some here, actually made by Miracle-Gro. But it's a volcanic rock that is crushed and heated to expansion. Light and uniform in size. Good aeration and drainage. If you're mixing soils, I always recommend putting some perlite in there because it helps with that water flow through capacity. You don't want to compact your soils in around your plants. And some disadvantages to this though are it's dusty, it floats during irrigation, and it may contain toxic fluorine. So you don't want to use a ton of perlite, but a little bit is okay. But if you start getting, if you start seeing your plants kind of waning a little bit, you might want to clear that perlite out of there at a later date to save your plants. But that's typically not something that happens very often. And It is used in hydroponics and aeroponics. We'll get into hydroponics later. That's a water-only growing system. We actually have one here on campus. So, vermiculite, a silicate material expanded by heating, high water holding capacity. So this stuff's actually going to hold your water in really well. So down here you have some vermiculite right here, and you have a little bit of perlite right above it. So this little brown stuff right here is going to hold a lot more water for you. So if you mix this and perlite together, you're going to have you might have a really good growing medium going. So an aid in aeration and drainage, and supplies potassium and magnesium. So this is also common in hydroponics. Like I said, we'll get into hydroponics at a later date, just because there's so much we can go over in greenhouse, but we don't want to take all the time in the world today. So calcined clay. This is a clay material heated to a high temperature, durable, really good water holding capacity, and commonly used in growing medium and for bonsai mediums. So if you ever go to like a trade show or anything and you see like somebody with some bonsai trees, typically it's gonna be like a really hard soil around the tree. That's actually that calcined clay. So some other inorganic materials: rock wool. That's a man-made material used in hydroponics. Volcanic rock, limestone, and coke melted, extruded, and pressed into shapes. So if you take a look over here, these little shapes building around it, these are strong enough to hold your plant inside, but it's not recommended for all plants because some plants, or a majority of plants, are actually going to want to grow in something that's a little bit softer and lighter. So also pumice, cinders, and pea gravel. So like these are all things that you can use as inorganic materials, but I really wouldn't recommend any of them unless it's for a really specific type of plant that likes a tougher growing environment. So some synthetic materials can take the place of sand and perlite. Polystyrene flakes. You'll find it's actually in some other stuff like we have Pro Mix in our greenhouse that we use from time to time, and this is actually what's in there. So the advantages: it's resistant to composition, so this will be around for a real long time, and increased aeration and drainage, and urea formaldehydes, air mixed with liquid resin and cold. Advantages: water holding capacity, aeration, drainage, easily transported. So some growing medium objectives: porous and well drained, yet retaining moisture, low soluble salts, standardized and uniform, no soil pests. Anything you pretty much buy in a store, you're never going to find a pest in. You're not going to find a disease in unless it's a bad batch. So if you open a bag up and it's not that rich brown soil, unless it's something else specified on the package, then typically you shouldn't find anything. But if you open that bag and it's like completely white and dried out, then you got to take that bag back. So biologically and chemically stable. So growing media for cost considerations. Transportation is a huge cost. So the lighter you can keep your soil, the less transportation you're going to spend. The labor going into it, equipment, materials, handling, and cost of custom mixing versus commercially prepared materials. So depending on what you want to use, sometimes it's better to do all the mixing yourself. But if you don't have all the time in the world to mix and you think it's going to cost more, then I would go with a commercially prepared material, like a Pro VX, a Miracle Grow soil, something that's going to be effective. But these are all pretty much things that you would talk about in any regular business. So, but that's all I have for you today. If I have any questions, please contact me down here in the landscape design classroom. And I appreciate your time, folks. Have a great day.